The chemical fires on New Corinth burned with colors that had no names in any human language, casting the bombed colony in shifting hues of toxic green and violet that made Captain David Sterling's eyes water even through his protective mask. The evacuation was proceeding as well as could be expected, which was to say it was barely controlled chaos, with civilians from a dozen different species fleeing toward human relief ships while rebel artillery continued to rain down on what remained of the city. "Captain," Lieutenant Sarah Kim called over the comm, "we've got maybe 30 minutes before the fires reach the fuel depot. After that, this whole district becomes a crater." David acknowledged the warning while directing another group of refugees toward the landing shuttles. His ship, the Sanctuary, was one of 6 human vessels providing emergency evacuation services to anyone who needed them, regardless of species or political affiliation. The policy had made him popular with refugees and unpopular with military commanders who thought humanitarian missions were a waste of resources during wartime. "All civilians clear from Sector 7, reported Sergeant Martinez from his position near the perimeter. "We can pull back to the secondary evacuation zone." David was about to give the order when he heard it, a child's voice crying for help in accented standard, barely audible over the sound of burning buildings and distant explosions. The voice was coming from a residential block that had taken a direct hit from rebel bombers, its multi-story structures reduced to smoking rubble. "Captain, we need to move," Lieutenant Kim urged. "That whole area is structurally unsound." But David was already running toward the collapsed building, following the sound of the child's cries through smoke that burned his lungs and heat that felt like standing too close to a star. His military training screamed warnings about unstable structures and toxic atmospheric conditions, but his conscience wouldn't let him abandon a child to die alone in the flames. He found the boy trapped beneath a fallen beam in what had once been a family apartment, surrounded by debris and the scattered remains of a life interrupted by war. The child appeared to be around 8 years old, with the distinctive pointed ears and luminescent skin that marked him as Zephyrian, though his clothes were too torn and dirty to indicate his social status. "Hey there," David said softly in standard, kneeling beside the trapped child and beginning to assess the situation. "I'm Captain Sterling. I'm here to help you." The boy looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face, golden irises that held both terror and a desperate hope. "My guardians," he whispered in heavily accented standard. The building fell." David followed the child's gaze to where 2 adult Zephyrians lay motionless beneath tons of rubble, clearly beyond any help he could provide. "I'm sorry," he said gently, meaning it. "But I'm going to get you out of here, okay?" Working quickly but carefully, David used his emergency cutting tools to slice through the metal beam that had pinned the boy's legs. The child, who managed to tell him his name was Calvin, bore the pain with remarkable stoicism, though tears streaked the soot on his face. "There we go," David said, lifting Calvin carefully and checking for serious injuries. "You're going to be all right. We're going to get you to safety." The journey back to the evacuation zone became a nightmare of collapsing structures and spreading fires, with David carrying the injured boy while navigating through destruction that grew worse by the minute. Calvin clung to him with desperate strength, his small hands gripping David's jacket as if letting go would mean death. "Almost there," David promised, though he wasn't sure either of them would make it out alive. The chemical fires were spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and the heat was becoming unbearable even through his protective gear. They reached the evacuation shuttles just as the first explosions began in the fuel depot, sending shockwaves through the ground that knocked David to his knees. He covered Calvin with his own body as debris rained down around them, protecting the child even as the world seemed to be ending in fire and thunder. "Medical team to Shuttle 3. David called as they reached safety, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "I've got an injured child who needs immediate attention." The Sanctuary's medical bay was organized chaos as human doctors and alien healers worked together to treat the injured refugees streaming aboard from the planet below. David stayed with Calvin throughout the initial medical examination, translating between the boy's limited standard and the medical team's questions. "No major injuries," reported Dr. Janet Foster, the ship's chief medical officer. Some bruising, minor lacerations, smoke inhalation. He's remarkably healthy considering what he's been through. But as the medical team moved on to other patients, David noticed that Kelvin seemed reluctant to let him leave. The boy's golden eyes tracked his every movement, and when David tried to step away to handle other duties, small hands reached out to catch his sleeve. "It's okay," David said softly, settling into a chair beside the medical bed. "I'm not going anywhere." Kelvin relaxed visibly at the reassurance, his luminescent skin beginning to regain some of its natural glow as the immediate trauma receded. "You saved me," he said in his careful standard. "Anyone would have done the same thing," David replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't have risked their lives for a stranger's child, especially not during a military evacuation. "In my language," Kelvin said quietly, "we have a word. Varthek. It means, one who gives life when death comes. One who chooses to risk everything for another." David felt something warm unfold in his chest at the solemn way the boy spoke. "What does that make me?" Kelvin's smile was radiant despite everything he'd been through. "It makes you my Varthek." "My." He struggled with the standard translation for a moment. "My father. The one who gave me life." The word hit David like a physical blow, awakening emotions he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. His own son had been Kelvin's age when the plague took him, and holding this frightened, brave child brought back memories that were both painful and precious. "Kelvin," he said carefully, "I'm honored that you feel that way. But I'm sure you have family, people who are looking for you." The boy's expression grew sad. "My guardians are gone. I don't know where. I don't know if anyone else survived." David found himself making a promise that surprised him with its intensity. "Then I'll take care of you until we find them. You're safe now, Kelvin. I won't let anything happen to you." As the sanctuary pulled away from New Corinth's atmosphere, carrying its cargo of refugees toward the safety of neutral space, David remained at Kelvin's bedside. The boy had fallen asleep holding David's hand, his luminescent skin glowing softly in the medical bay's dim lighting. Dr. Foster approached quietly, her expression thoughtful. "Captain, I've never seen a Zephyrian child bond so quickly with a human. Usually their people are much more reserved with other species." "Trauma does things to people," David replied, though he was beginning to suspect there was more to Kelvin's attachment than simple gratitude. "He's lost everything. Right now, I'm the only stable thing in his world. And how do you feel about that responsibility?" David looked down at the sleeping child, seeing echoes of his own lost son in the peaceful expression. "Like I've been given a second chance I don't deserve," he said quietly. "And like I'll do anything to make sure I don't waste it." What he didn't yet understand was that his rescue of one frightened child had set in motion events that would reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. Kelvin was not just another refugee, he was the crown prince of the Zephyrian Empire, and his declaration of David as his father would create diplomatic, political, and personal complications that none of them could yet imagine. 3 days into their journey toward the neutral refugee processing station at Kepler Station, David had fallen into a routine that revolved entirely around Kelvin's needs and recovery. The boy followed him everywhere, through the ship's corridors during his captain's rounds, into the bridge during shift changes, even sleeping on a makeshift bed in David's quarters when nightmares made him afraid to be alone. "Father," Kelvin said during one of their language lessons, using the standard word with careful pronunciation, "why do your people help strangers?" The guardians said humans only care about profit and territory. David paused in reviewing the refugee manifests he'd been updating with Kelvin's help. The boy had a remarkable memory for details and had been assisting with translations between various Zephyrian dialects represented among their passengers. "Some humans are like that," David admitted honestly. "But others believe that helping people in need is what makes us, well, human. That our worth isn't measured by what we own, but by what we're willing to give up for others." Kelvin nodded solemnly, processing this information with the kind of thoughtful consideration that continued to surprise David. The boy was clearly intelligent beyond his years, with an intuitive understanding of complex social dynamics that seemed almost adult-like. In Zephyrian culture, Calvin said carefully, we have classes. Noble families, warrior castes, worker guilds. Each has different, what is the word, obligations. Different responsibilities to society, David confirmed. What obligations do you have? For just a moment, something flickered across Calvin's expression, a hint of knowledge or burden that seemed too heavy for a child. But then he smiled and shrugged. I don't know yet. The guardians said I would learn when I was older. Their conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Kim's voice over the intercom. Captain to the bridge. We have incoming vessels requesting communication. David found 3 Zephyrian military ships on long-range sensors, approaching fast and broadcasting official Imperial codes. Their formation suggested escort duties rather than hostile intent, but their presence in neutral space raised immediate questions. This is Captain Sterling of the humanitarian vessel Sanctuary, David transmitted on standard diplomatic frequencies. Please state your intentions regarding our refugee convoy. The response came in heavily accented standard from someone clearly used to command authority. Captain Sterling, I am Commander Vextai of the Imperial Guard. We are conducting search operations for persons of interest to Zephyrian security. Request permission to inspect your passenger manifests. David felt a chill run down his spine. Commander, this vessel carries civilian refugees under neutral protection accords. I cannot allow armed military personnel to interrogate passengers without proper legal authority. Captain, Commander Vextai's voice carried barely controlled impatience, we are not requesting, we are informing you of Imperial requirements. Prepare for boarding operations. The standoff that followed tested every diplomatic skill David had developed during his years commanding relief missions. The Zephyrian ships had enough firepower to destroy the Sanctuary without effort, but attacking a neutral humanitarian vessel would create massive political complications that even the Zephyrian Empire would prefer to avoid. Father, Calvin said quietly, appearing at David's side despite David's earlier instructions to stay in their quarters during potential conflict situations, perhaps I should speak with them. Calvin, this is military business, David replied, though something in the boy's tone made him pause. These are important people with official authority. I know, Calvin said simply. Then, before David could stop him, he stepped forward and activated the communication console. What followed left the entire bridge crew in stunned silence. Calvin spoke to the Zephyrian commander in rapid, formal dialect that carried unmistakable authority despite coming from a child's voice. The language was archaic, ceremonial, the kind of high Zephyrian that David had only heard in historical recordings of imperial pronouncements. Commander Vextai's response was immediate and dramatic. His transmission shifted from demanding to deeply respectful, with formal honorifics that David's translation software identified as being reserved for the highest levels of Zephyrian nobility. Young Prince, Commander Vextai said, his voice now filled with barely controlled emotion, we have searched every system, every refugee center, we thought you were lost. Prince. The word hit David like a plasma bolt to the chest as he suddenly understood why Calvin had seemed different from other children, why Zephyrian officials had shown unusual interest in refugee reports, why the boy possessed such natural dignity and intelligence. He had rescued the heir to the Zephyrian Empire. I am well, Commander, Calvin replied with regal composure that seemed impossible from someone his age. I have been cared for by my Varthek, my chosen father, Captain David Sterling. He risked his life to save mine when the Guardians fell. The silence on the communication channel stretched for long seconds before Commander Vextai spoke again, his voice thick with implications that David was only beginning to understand. Your chosen father, the commander repeated slowly. Prince Calvin, does this human understand the significance of your declaration? Calvin looked up at David with golden eyes that held both innocence and ancient wisdom. He will, the boy said simply. Father, Commander Vextai requests permission to escort us to Zephyrian Prime. My mother wishes to thank you personally for my rescue. David found his voice, though it sounded strange in his own ears. Your mother. The Queen. Queen Lyralii of the Third House, protector of the inner worlds, guardian of the crystal throne, Calvin recited formally, then smiled with childlike affection. But yes, my mother. She will want to meet the Varthek who gave her son back his life. As the sanctuary altered course toward Zephyrian space under heavy escort, David struggled to process the magnitude of what had happened. He had unknowingly rescued the most important child in the Zephyrian Empire, and that child had claimed him as family using terms that apparently carried significant legal and cultural weight. Calvin, David said privately after the communication ended, when you call me father, what exactly does that mean in your culture? The boy considered the question with the same thoughtful seriousness he brought to all their conversations. It means you chose to risk everything to save me when you could have stayed safe. It means I trust you more than anyone else in the universe. It means... He paused, searching for the right words in standard. It means family is not just blood, but choice. And I choose you. David felt something warm and terrifying settle in his chest as he realized that his simple act of humanitarian rescue had created bonds that would reshape his entire life. He had pulled a child from burning rubble, thinking only of saving an innocent life. Instead, he had gained a son who happened to be a prince, and earned the attention of a queen whose gratitude might prove more dangerous than her enemies. The sanctuary continued toward Zephyrian Prime, carrying refugees to safety and one human captain toward a destiny he never could have imagined. In his quarters, Calvin slept peacefully for the first time since his rescue, secure in the knowledge that his chosen father would protect him from whatever challenges lay ahead. What none of them yet understood was that those challenges would test not just David's courage, but his capacity for a love that transcended species, politics, and the vast distances between worlds. Zephyrian Prime appeared on the sanctuary's viewscreens like a jewel suspended in space, a world of crystalline cities and flowing architecture that seemed to grow from the planet's surface rather than being built upon it. David had seen images of the Zephyrian capital before, but witnessing it in person while surrounded by an honor guard of Imperial warships made him acutely aware that he was no longer just a relief ship captain carrying refugees to safety. He was approaching the heart of one of the galaxy's most powerful empires, accompanying their crown prince home after the most dramatic experience of the boy's young life. Father, Calvin said from beside him on the bridge, using the title that still made David's heart skip a beat, are you nervous about meeting my mother? David looked down at the boy, noting how different Calvin seemed now that he was approaching home. The frightened child David had rescued still existed, but there was also a growing awareness of his royal identity and the responsibilities that came with it. A little, David admitted honestly. I've never met a queen before. I'm not sure about the proper protocols. Just be yourself, Calvin said with the kind of simple wisdom that children sometimes possessed. She will like you because you saved me. And because you are good. The docking procedures at Zephyrian Prime were unlike anything David had experienced. Instead of the utilitarian efficiency of most spaceports, the Imperial facility was a work of art, flowing curves and crystalline structures that seemed to sing with harmonic frequencies as ships moved through carefully choreographed approach patterns. Captain Sterling, came a transmission from orbital control, you are cleared for direct approach to Royal Dock 7. Her Majesty Queen Lyralii will receive you immediately upon arrival. David felt his stomach tighten with nerves as the sanctuary settled into the designated berth. Through the viewports, he could see ceremonial guards in elaborate armor taking positions around the docking area, while officials in flowing robes prepared what appeared to be a formal reception. This seems like a lot of ceremony for returning one refugee, David observed to Lieutenant Kim. Sir, she replied carefully, I don't think Calvin is just any refugee. The way those Imperial ships have been treating us, the priority clearances, the royal dock assignment, that boy is someone very important. David was still processing the implications when the airlock cycled and revealed a sight that made him instinctively straighten his uniform. Queen Lyralii of the Zephyrian Empire stood in the docking bay surrounded by an entourage that radiated power and authority, but David's attention was immediately captured by the Queen herself. She was tall and graceful with the luminescent skin and pointed ears that marked her species, but there was something else, a presence that commanded respect without effort, intelligence that seemed to miss nothing, and underneath it all, the barely controlled desperation of a mother who had thought her child was lost forever. "Calvin," she called, and a regal composure cracked as her son ran toward her with joyful tears. David watched the reunion with emotions he couldn't quite name, seeing the relief and love that transformed Queen Lyraliai's face as she held her son. But even as she embraced Calvin, her eyes found David over the boy's head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like he was being evaluated on levels he didn't understand. "Mother," Calvin said in standard, clearly wanting David to understand the conversation, "this is my Varthek, my chosen father, Captain David Sterling. He saved my life when the Guardians could not." Queen Lyraliai gently disentangled herself from her son and approached David with measured steps that somehow managed to be both graceful and intimidating. Up close, she was even more imposing, not just physically, but with the kind of presence that came from wielding absolute power over worlds and stars. "Captain Sterling," she said, her accented standard formal but warm, "my son tells me you risked your life to save his." In Zephyrian culture, such actions create bonds that transcend politics and species. David found his voice, though it sounded rougher than usual. "Your Majesty, I was just doing what anyone would do. Calvin needed help, and I was able to provide it." "No," Queen Lyraliai said firmly, her golden eyes holding his gaze. "Not anyone would enter a burning building to save a stranger's child. Not anyone would care for that child as their own during a dangerous journey. You chose to risk everything for someone you had never met." She paused, and David could see her struggling with emotions that her royal training had taught her to control. "You gave me back my son, Captain Sterling. There is no gift more precious in any civilization." "He's a remarkable boy," David replied, glancing at Calvin who was watching their interaction with obvious satisfaction. "He's been through terrible trauma, but his courage and intelligence are extraordinary." "Yes," Queen Lyraliai agreed, but something in her tone suggested deeper meaning. "He is extraordinary. And he has chosen to name you Varthek, his life-giver, his chosen father. Do you understand what this means in our culture?" David felt the weight of implications he was only beginning to grasp. "Honestly, Your Majesty, I'm not sure I do. But I care about Calvin deeply, and I want to do right by him." Queen Lyraliai's expression softened slightly, and for a moment David saw not the ruler of an empire but a mother who had nearly lost her child. In Zephyrian law, the declaration of Varthek creates family bonds that are considered as binding as blood relations. When Calvin named you his chosen father, he was not simply expressing gratitude, he was claiming you as family. She moved closer, her voice dropping to ensure privacy. "More than that, Captain Sterling. Calvin is the crown prince of our empire. His declaration makes you, by law and custom, a member of the royal family with all the rights, responsibilities, and protections that status entails." David felt the ground shift beneath his feet as he understood the magnitude of what had happened. "Your Majesty, I never intended, I was just trying to help a child in need." "I know," Queen Lyraliai said gently. "Which is exactly why Calvin's choice honors both of you. He saw in you the qualities that our people value most, courage, compassion, the willingness to sacrifice for others." Their conversation was interrupted as Calvin took David's hand and pulled him toward the royal entourage. "Father, come meet the council members. They want to thank you properly." As David found himself being introduced to imperial ministers and military commanders as Prince Calvin's chosen father, he began to understand that his life had fundamentally changed in ways he was still struggling to comprehend. But watching Calvin's happiness at being home, seeing the relief and gratitude in Queen Lyraliai's eyes, David realized that some changes were worth the complications they brought. He had gained not just a son, but a place in a family and culture that operated by rules completely different from anything he'd known. The question now was whether he was strong enough to live up to the trust that had been placed in him, and wise enough to navigate the political and personal challenges that came with being claimed by a prince. As they moved through the crystal corridors of the royal palace, Kelvin chattering excitedly about showing David his rooms and his collection of star charts, David caught Queen Lyralii watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. It looked almost like hope, but hope for what, he wasn't yet ready to ask. 2 weeks in the Zephyrian royal palace had given David a crash course in imperial politics, alien customs, and the complex responsibilities that came with being claimed as family by a crown prince. He'd been assigned quarters that were larger than his entire ship, attended formal dinners where conversations were conducted in 3 languages simultaneously, and learned that every gesture carried diplomatic significance he'd never imagined. But it was his private moments with Kelvin and Queen Lyralii that mattered most. Evening walks through the palace gardens where Kelvin could be a normal child rather than a prince, quiet conversations with the queen about her son's education and emotional recovery, and the growing sense that he had found something precious that he hadn't even known he was looking for. "Father," Kelvin said during one of their nightly story sessions, "will you stay here forever? Even after I don't need protection anymore?" David paused in reading the Zephyrian legend they'd been enjoying together, noting the vulnerability in the boy's voice despite his careful phrasing. "Kelvin, what makes you think I would leave?" "The council members whisper that you're only here temporarily," Kelvin admitted. "That once the war ends and things are safe, you'll go back to your ship and your missions." The conversation revealed something David had been trying not to think about: what happened to his old life now that he'd been thrust into circumstances he'd never anticipated. His ship was being maintained by his crew, but how long could he remain in the palace before duty called him back to humanitarian work? "Would you want me to stay?" David asked carefully. "Yes," Kelvin said without hesitation. "And I think Mother would too." Before David could respond to that surprising observation, emergency alarms began echoing through the palace corridors. Red warning lights bathed the ornate rooms in ominous color while automated voices announced lockdown protocols in multiple languages. "All royal family members to secure locations immediately," came the announcement. "The palace is under attack." David's military training kicked in instantly, overriding the diplomatic protocols he'd been learning. "Kelvin, we need to get you to the safe room. Now." But as they moved through corridors filled with running guards and panicked staff, David realized the attack was more serious than initial reports suggested. Explosions shook the massive structure while energy weapons fire could be heard getting closer to the royal quarters. They found Queen Lyralii in the central command chamber, still wearing her formal robes but now surrounded by military advisors and tactical displays showing enemy forces that had somehow penetrated the planet's legendary defenses. "Rebel strike teams," she reported to David without preamble, apparently considering him part of the inner circle during crisis situations. They'd been planning this for months: simultaneous attacks on military installations, government centers, and the palace itself. "Mother," Kelvin said with remarkable calm for a child in the middle of a battle, "where is the safest place for father?" Queen Lyralii's eyes met David's across the command chamber, and he saw a flash of something that might have been fear, not for herself, but for him. "Captain Sterling, my security chief will escort you to the protected bunkers with the other non-combatants." "No," David said firmly, surprising everyone including himself. "I'm staying with Kelvin. If he's in danger, I'm not leaving his side." "David," Queen Lyralii said, using his first name for the first time, "you're not trained for palace defense. This isn't a humanitarian mission. These are professional assassins targeting my family specifically." "Then they're targeting my son," David replied, the words coming out with fierce protectiveness that amazed him. "Your Majesty, I've been in combat situations before. I'm not helpless, and I'm not abandoning Kelvin when he needs protection." The argument was settled by another explosion, this one close enough to shake dust from the crystal ceiling. A harried security officer burst into the command chamber with urgent reports. "Majesty, they've breached the inner perimeter. Multiple strike teams, heavily armed, moving toward the royal quarters. We're falling back to final defensive positions." Queen Lyralii's expression hardened with the kind of determination that had made her people respect her as both ruler and warrior. Then we make our stand here. Captain Sterling, if you insist on staying, you'll need this. She handed him a Zephyrian energy weapon, its biomechanical grip adapting instantly to his human physiology. The weapon will respond to your neural patterns. Point, think, fire, and it will discharge. What followed was the most intense combat experience of David's life. The rebels came in waves, their attack coordinated and professional, clearly planned by someone with detailed knowledge of palace defenses. But they hadn't counted on facing a human veteran whose protective instincts had been awakened by threats to his adopted son. David found himself fighting alongside Zephyrian royal guards, his practical military experience complementing their advanced training and superior equipment. More importantly, he discovered that his determination to protect Kelvin gave him focus and courage that surprised even him. "Behind you!" Kelvin called out during one exchange, his young voice cutting through weapons fire with sharp urgency. David spun and fired, dropping a rebel who had flanked their position while he was focused on frontal attackers. The boy's tactical awareness was keeping him alive in situations that should have overwhelmed a civilian. "Good eyes," David called back, reloading his weapon while Queen Lyralii coordinated defensive positions with her guard commanders. The battle turned when reinforcements arrived, not just palace security, but David's own crew from the sanctuary, led by Lieutenant Kim and armed with human military equipment. "Captain." Kim called over the weapon's fire. "We monitored the emergency broadcasts and figured you might need backup." The combination of Zephyrian tactical skill and human adaptability proved devastatingly effective against rebels who had planned for one type of opposition but found themselves facing something unprecedented. When the last attacker had been neutralized, the palace fell into exhausted silence broken only by the sounds of medical teams treating the wounded. "That was extraordinary," Queen Lyralii said to David as they checked on Kelvin's condition. The boy was shaken but unharmed, his composure throughout the battle proving he truly was his mother's son. "You fought like you were protecting your own blood family." "I was," David replied simply, pulling Kelvin into a protective embrace. "This is my family now, isn't it?" Queen Lyralii's smile was radiant despite the stress and exhaustion of battle. "Yes, David Sterling. You are family. In every way that matters." As palace staff began the enormous task of cleaning up after the attack, David found himself in Queen Lyralii's private study, finally having the conversation that had been building between them for weeks. "David," she said quietly, "what you did tonight, fighting for my son, for our people. It goes beyond the obligations of a chosen father." "Does it?" David asked, settling into a chair across from her. "Because it felt like exactly what a father should do when his family is threatened." "And what about what a husband should do?" Queen Lyralii asked softly, her golden eyes holding his gaze with vulnerability that her public role never allowed her to show. David felt his heart stop for a moment as he processed what she was suggesting. "Lyralii, are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking," she said, moving closer until they were sharing the same breath, "whether you would consider making your place in our family permanent. Not just as Kelvin's chosen father, but as my chosen partner. My consort. My equal in ruling this empire and raising our son." David looked into her eyes, seeing past the royal bearing to the woman who had trusted him with her most precious treasure, her child's safety and happiness. "What would that mean?" "For both our peoples, for the political implications." "It would mean," Queen Lyralii replied, taking his hands in hers, "showing the galaxy that love and family can transcend any barrier between species. That strength comes not from isolation, but from choosing to build something beautiful together." She smiled, and David saw in her expression the same hope he'd been trying not to acknowledge in his own heart. "Besides, Kelvin has been plotting to make this happen since the day we met. He's remarkably perceptive for an 8-year-old. David laughed, thinking of all the times Kelvin had engineered private moments between his mother and his chosen father. "He has, hasn't he?" "So," Queen Lyralii said, "what do you say, Captain David Sterling? Will you stay with us? Will you help me raise the future emperor of the Zephyrian people?" Will you be my partner in everything that matters? David thought about his old life. The lonely ship voyages, the constant humanitarian crises, the sense that he was always helping others but never truly belonging anywhere. Then he looked at this remarkable woman who was offering him not just love, but purpose and family and a place in something greater than himself. Yes, he said, pulling her close. Yes to all of it. Yes to staying, yes to raising Calvin together, yes to building a future neither of us could have imagined. Their first kiss tasted of crystal wine and determination, sealed by the understanding that they had found something worth protecting in each other. When they finally separated, they found Calvin watching from the doorway with obvious satisfaction, his young face bright with joy at seeing his two favorite people finally acknowledging what he'd known all along. Does this mean David is really staying forever? Calvin asked with 8-year-old directness. Forever, Queen Lyralii confirmed, ruffling her son's hair while keeping one arm around David. Your chosen father is now my chosen partner. We're a family, all three of us. As they stood together in the palace study, surrounded by the evidence of a battle won and a future secured, David realized that his simple act of rescuing a child from fire had led him to something he'd never dared hope for, a love that spanned species and worlds, a son who challenged him to be better than he'd ever imagined, and a purpose that gave meaning to everything he'd experienced. He had saved Calvin without knowing who the boy was. In return, the prince had given him a family, a home, and a love story that would reshape both their people's understanding of what was possible when hearts chose connection over fear.